I saw a question regarding the making of audio-visual recently. It was, what should be the optimum image size for making audio-visual presentations? And I thought that was a pretty good question that may be well answered by a video. Now, the problem with this question is I would need more information to be able to answer it effectively. Because it rather depends, and I know the answer "it depends" is not very helpful, but it rather depends, for example, on what publish option you intend to choose when you make your audio visual. Are you going to be using an executable file, or are you going to be making an MP4? Is your computer up to date and powerful, or is it a 14-year-old laptop? There's a number of questions we really need to know. So let's see if we can provide some answers. Once we decide we've finished our slideshow and we're ready to publish that show, we broadly have two options. We have one option, which we generally hear called the executable file, and that will only be playable on a PC or an Apple Mac. The other option is a video of some type, and the most common of those is an MP4, which will play on almost any computer or any device we can dream up. So the question is, which one of these two options are we going to choose? How is that going to impact the size of the images we choose for our slideshow? Let's see if we can answer that by first looking at the options for an executable presentation. These files are quite limited in that they can only be played on a computer. Until recently, it was just PC computers, but now the software is available for both PC and Macs. Now, I can give you a couple of reasons why this may be the choice for some users of PTE AV Studio, and I'm sure I'm not going to encompass every single one there is. But I think there's two broad reasons for making an executable presentation. One of those is that the presentation you're making is interactive. In other words, there's some sort of buttons or some sort of options within it that requires the viewer or the user to make a choice and choose to run another presentation or a bit of audio or a bit of video. But you can't do that if you're going to output the presentation to a video. In that case, the video will just run from start to finish, and all you can do is just pause it. Now, the other reason an executable file may be our choice, and I've used this myself a number of times, if you want to use this software to give a presentation, maybe a talk to your photographic club, then we can set up the software so that the slides don't change until we touch a key on the keyboard or we click the mouse. So we can use it rather like a PowerPoint presentation, but of course we can do a much better job with PTE AV Studio. Now, when we publish our presentation as a video, there's a number of other options. Firstly, we can display our presentation on any Mac or PC computer. There's no different to the executable file, but of course a video will run and stop and pause, but that's about it. An MP4 video will run on all mobile devices, iPads, iPhones, and everything of a similar nature. We can also upload those videos to our social media, YouTube, Vimeo, Facebook, and I'm sure there's hundreds more. In addition, a video will play on all smart TVs and most large flat screen TVs via a USB stick, as long as they're not too old. The next question we may wish to ask is, what would be the difference if we made a slideshow, such as this one here, including 30 images from a high-resolution camera and 3 pieces of music, all MP3s? If we publish that as an MP4 video and also as an executable file, how would they compare? Well, we can do that because that's exactly what I've done with the images you can see here on screen. So let's take a look at this slideshow as an executable file and also as an MP4. Now what we're viewing here is Windows Explorer, and you can see I've opened up my folder which contains all of the content for that test slideshow. So the top you can see the 30 images that I've used and the sizes of them on the right hand side. Below them you can see the 3 pieces of music in MP3 format and also the file sizes of those. Right down the bottom you can see the project file. Now that's an important thing to consider for a moment. When you consider the file size of everything else, the little file that tells the software exactly where everything is and every setting we've used is tiny by comparison. So never worry about saving as many project files as you wish. But when we come to look at the file sizes for the executable and the MP4, look at the difference. The file size for the executable is almost 1 gigabyte in size, whereas the MP4 is 122 megabyte in size. The quality is going to be directly comparable. I defy any of you will notice the difference. So why is there such a difference in file size? The executable file retains all of the images at their full resolution size, even though we're publishing a HD presentation at 1920 pixels by 1080. The MP4 video doesn't do this. It has to produce 60 frames per second, but that's far less in size than our executable file. So now we're beginning to get an answer to the original question of what's the best image size for audio-visual. Imagine you want to publish an executable high-resolution image show that may contain some animation too. You've got a couple of hurdles to clear. The first of those is, what is the power of the computer you're using to make the show? And what is the power of the computer that may be used to play that show to an audience? Because they could be very different in power, and they quite often are. Let's suppose your computer is quite old, and while it may be capable of making a presentation using high-resolution images, you could find a lack of power in that computer means that your creative progress is dragged almost to a stop. Everything can get very frustrating and difficult. In this scenario, we should consider resizing images in an image editor to the size of the show you're making, plus maybe 20%, to allow for a little animation. Now, even if your PC or Mac computer is top-notch, you may have no idea if your show will be played back on a 14-year-old laptop so full of programs it can hardly boot. It really isn't uncommon for this to happen in some clubs and societies. Their laptop is so old that it's almost steam-driven. If your masterpiece presentation that runs to perfection on your state-of-the-art computer grinds to a stop on that steam-driven laptop in front of an audience, it's you who feels the embarrassment. So if you're happy to publish to an MP4 video, the only issue you have to ask is, can my PC or Mac computer handle the making of the show? If so, then you don't have to resize images at all if you don't wish to. So let's assume that you find yourself in the position where you do need to reduce the size of your images. You need to make a choice, I suppose, between whether you're going to output at the HD resolution of 1920 1080 pixels or maybe the 4K resolution of 3840 by 2160. Then of course we may have to consider adding 20% if we intend to do any animation. Is that a difficult job? No, not really. It's quite easy in both Photoshop and Lightroom. Here I'm in Photoshop. Now let's just assume with this particular image on screen that I want to publish my show to HD size, 1920 1080. If I select the crop tool, I can go to the top of the screen here, and in the values here I can actually type in 1920 pixels by 1080. And of course, if I wanted to increase that slightly to include, let's say, 20% more for a bit of animation within my presentation, then I would be putting into those boxes something like 2304 on the long side by 1296 in the vertical side. But it actually gets easier than that. If I come away from this for a moment and I clear that, we can save any of the options that we wish. So if I go to the options here and just click HD, there's something I've created previously. And if I want HD plus that 20% for animation, I can select that. And now we can see the size is the same as I mentioned a few moments ago, 2304 pixels, 1296. Yes, I'm going to lose a little bit of this image, but I do have the opportunity to choose which part I'm going to lose. And of course, there are other techniques we can use as well. But generally, once I hit the tick on the options bar, I can then save this as a JPEG and the picture has been reduced in size. And with a different image on screen, you'll notice that when I selected the crop and the presets up here, that I did have one for 4K, and there's the 4K size, 4K plus 20%, there it is there. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to select a section of this to be 4K. Let's put the horizon on that line. I'll hit the enter key and I'll save this, and we'll take a look at this in PTE AV Studio. So with PTE open, I'm going to go to File New to set up a new project. In the aspect ratio, I'm going to choose Custom, because in the values that should be popping up, there you go, I'm going to put in there the 4K values. They are 3840. That's the long side, of course, and on the height, 2160. So we've set up the parameters for the presentation we're going to make, but we're only interested in looking at this image. So let's drag that down, and I'll open up the Objects and Animation screen and we can take a look. So here we have a resized image saved as a JPEG around level 8, so we've got quite a small file. But where's that extra 20%? Because it seems to be fitting our slideshow size, because remember, this black shape represents our 16:9 aspect ratio slideshow, and in our case it's the 4K size. Let me put that back in position with Ctrl Z. Well, we can see the 20% by going to the zoom factor. I'm going to right click over the X and choose original size. Now we can see it. Not only can we see it, if I was to insert a keyframe at the end and set the zoom back, you can see, if I do a little demonstration here, that the size that we've allowed, that 20%, is more than enough for a zoom out. And of course it would work exactly the same with a zoom in. What I could also do is use the same size. Instead of zooming out this time, maybe I could pan to the left. Let me go to the final keyframe. I'll reset that pan into the center, the zoom, I want that back up to original size, and now I need the pan to the right. So there you can see there's the keyframe starting, there's the keyframe ending the movement. Let's go back to the start, and you can see once again with a quick demonstration we've got more than enough with that 20% to cope with a nice pan as well. If you're a Lightroom user, the procedure is very much the same. I would go to the crop tool in the develop module, but what I may need to do here is to go to the options under this little original label, because I need to enter a custom aspect ratio, because you can see that we do have a 16:9 here, but it's also going to reduce the image to 1920 1080. Now, if we were to be considering making a slideshow at 4K, then that's too small. So we'd need to go to enter custom, and we'd need to change the aspect ratio here to 16:9. Now that means that my crop is going to be at the right aspect ratio, and there you can see exactly the same thing that we saw in Photoshop, and I can click done to that, but it's retained most of the pixels in this shot. What we need to do is when we export this image, that's when we need to put in the pixel dimensions for 4K plus 20%, 4608 by 2592. So going back to the library module and then down to the left to the export, we would choose where we want this image to be located, and if we were preparing images for a slideshow, we'd probably have a slideshow project folder created. But I'll just go down to the options here because I'd probably be selecting a quality of 8. And if we go down just a little further, what I'm looking for, that's what I'm looking for here, resize to fit. So it's in this little box that I will be putting my 4608 via 2592, which is my 4K size plus 20% for the animation we've just seen demonstrated in PTE AV Studio. Now here we're back in PTE AV Studio, and I've loaded up that test slideshow using high resolution images. So if your intention is to publish your show as an MP4, then if I highlight this image here, if you take a look just below this and to the left, you can see the pixel value is 81925464. It's about 3:2 aspect ratio. I may have cropped this a little bit during the manipulation, but not much. If I select it and open it in the Objects and Animation screen, we can clearly see the difference between 16:9 aspect ratio shown to us by that black oblong shape and the shape of the image. So here we can see that we're not going to be seeing the top part of the image in our slideshow or the bottom part, which does give us the opportunity, of course, to decide which part of the image we think is important to view. But without drifting too much from the subject here, there is another option. Let me just recenter these for a moment. Because what we can do with some images, not all, but with some images, we can compress them a little bit, maybe save a bit of time. To do that with this particular image, and I've deliberately chosen a landscape because they work well with this sort of technique. If we go to the zoom factor and we click to unlink the height and the width, then what I can do here is I can drag the corner toggle and it will all remain in register. But if I just unlink here and go to the zoom Y, you can see the difference. Now some images will not be able to take that sort of distortion, but I would argue that many of our landscapes and many of our images will take some, if not all, of that compression. Anytime you want to return this back, you can lock it, by the way, Once you've locked it, now the aspect ratio will remain, but at any time we can just unlink that, double click the Y, double click the X, relink it, and we're back to where we started. Coming back into our main PTE AV Studio window, we've completed our slideshow with high resolution images, so now we're going to choose to publish that show. The option we're going to select is this one, HD and 4K video. Now of course I've centered around 4K plus 20%, but I've also mentioned the HD size plus 20%. The actual size you want to make, that's going to have to be a personal choice for you. But let's just consider this scenario. Let's output this particular show to 1920x1080. We're going to make sure that we change not much in this panel, but make sure you've got 60p selected so we get really smooth transitions and animations. Now, why do I choose 1920x1080? Well, let's just assume that you're a Camera Club member and maybe you're making a presentation to show through the Camera Club's projector and laptop, which is likely to be around that sort of size. So you can click OK here and you can create your MP4 video. But because you've made your slideshow with high resolution images, you can go to this option and you could go to the 4K resolution 3840 2160, and you can output a second show, maybe for your own use because you have a new state-of-the-art TV where you can see this at 4K in all of its glory. At this stage I need to bring this video to a close because I've kept you viewing for just over 20 minutes, and I think that's long enough with a simple question like what is the optimal size of the images for an audio-visual presentation. But as you've seen demonstrated, it does rather depend. I'll see you next time.